Somewhere in the Bavarian countryside, in the spring of 1945, American soldiers pushed open the door to what they thought was an abandoned house. Instead, they walked into a nursery full of babies. Hundreds of them. No mothers in sight, no fathers on record. Just numbered files, medical charts, and a filing cabinet that would expose one of the darkest secrets of the Nazi regime. Because these weren't ordinary children. They had been bred, measured, and manufactured, engineered like livestock to build a future master race. And what investigators uncovered inside those walls was so disturbing, it would stay buried for decades. This is the story the world tried to forget. This is Lebensborn, the Nazis' human breeding program. Stop scrolling for 1 second. If dark history like this deserves to be remembered, not buried, hit subscribe right now. Because W2 Real History is the only place bringing you the chapters other channels are too scared to touch. Comment Lungine45 below if you're ready for this one. And stay to the end. Because what happened to these children after the war is even harder to hear. To understand why this program existed, you have to go back to a broken Germany in the years after World War I. The war had wiped out an entire generation of young men. Millions of fathers, sons, and brothers never came home. The economy that followed was in ruins. Inflation so severe that people pushed wheelbarrows of cash just to buy bread. Families who could barely feed themselves stopped having children altogether. Birth rates collapsed. To the men who would later run the Nazi Party, this wasn't just a demographic problem. It was an existential threat. A nation without children was a nation without a future, and without an army. But it wasn't simply about having more babies. It was about having the right babies. Hitler and the inner circle around him were fixated on a fantasy of racial purity. Blonde hair, blue eyes, so-called Aryan bloodlines. In their twisted worldview, anyone outside that narrow image wasn't just different, they were a danger to the nation's survival. The man who turned this obsession into an actual institution was Heinrich Himmler. Head of the SS. Himmler didn't just see the SS as soldiers. He saw them as breeding stock for the future of the Reich. He believed that if Germany was going to win the wars he was already dreaming of, it needed a new generation engineered from birth, physically flawless, fanatically loyal, and racially pure, by Nazi standards. In December 1935, that obsession became policy. Himmler launched a new program under SS control, framed to the public as a charitable support system for expecting mothers, medical care, a safe place to give birth, financial help. On the surface, it looked almost humane. Underneath, it was something else entirely, a machine for deciding who was allowed to reproduce, and what kind of human being was allowed to exist. They called it Lebensborn, fountain of life. The name promised hope. What it delivered was control. As Lebensborn expanded, it stopped being about simply encouraging birth. It became a full-blown screening system. Women who wanted in were examined like livestock. Officers measured skull shape, recorded eye color, checked hair color, cataloged height. Family trees were investigated going back generations, hunting for any hint of Jewish, Roma, or politically undesirable ancestry. One distant relative could disqualify an entire application. Those who passed were often encouraged to give birth outside of marriage, something that would have brought deep social shame in that era. The SS promised there would be no punishment, no judgment. Instead, the state would step in as a kind of surrogate family. Many of the fathers were SS officers themselves, but they rarely stuck around. Their involvement usually ended at a signature on a birth record. Mothers were left in the hands of state-run staff, raising children the regime considered state property before they'd even taken their first breath. The birthing homes themselves were built to look peaceful. Quiet countryside estates, manicured gardens trained nurses. Comfortable on the outside, completely controlled on the inside. Some women genuinely believed in the ideology and volunteered proudly. Others were manipulated, pressured, or simply saw no other option in a country growing more dangerous by the day. Once the war began, walking away from the program became almost impossible. But here's where the story stops being disturbing and becomes terrifying. After Germany invaded Poland in 1939, the SS didn't just want territory. They wanted people, specifically, children who physically matched their racial fantasy. Special SS units moved through occupied Poland, Czechoslovakia, and parts of the Soviet Union, walking into schools, orphanages, and homes. They measured children's skulls. They inspected hair and eye color. They dug through family records looking for the correct bloodline. And when they found a child who fit the mold, they took them, not with paperwork, not with consent. Parents were lied to, told their children were being sent away for schooling or medical treatment. Others were simply overpowered, while soldiers tore their children out of their arms. Once taken, these children were shipped deep into Germany, often hundreds of miles from anything familiar. Their birth names were erased and replaced with German ones. Speaking their native language was treated as an act of defiance, and defiance was punished harshly. Every reaction, every attempt to adapt or resist, was logged by officials treating these children like experimental subjects. Kids who didn't measure up during follow-up evaluations were shipped off to orphanages, labor camps, or simply vanished from any record at all. Families back home were left with nothing, no explanation, no trace, no closure. By the middle of the war, Lebensborn had morphed from a births-only program into an organized kidnapping operation stretching across an entire continent. Estimates suggest tens of thousands of children were taken from occupied territories in this manner, a number historians still debate today because so many records were destroyed. When Germany invaded Norway in 1940, the SS thought they'd hit the jackpot. Norwegians, with their typically fair hair and light eyes, fit the Nazi racial fantasy almost perfectly. Lebensborn homes sprang up across the Norwegian countryside, hidden in quiet towns, disguised as maternity clinics for women who became pregnant by German soldiers stationed there. The scale here was staggering. Over 12,000 children were born through Lebensborn in Norway alone. Every birth was documented. Every child was measured, catalogued, and assigned a file. Some were shipped off to Germany to be raised by SS-approved families. Others stayed in Norway but remained tracked within the system for their entire childhood. There were no chains, no cages. But make no mistake, the control was total. Diet, health routines, upbringing, even language were dictated by the state. Norway became the blueprint for how efficiently Lebensborn could operate once it crossed German borders, run entirely through bureaucracy instead of brute force. Now here's the moment everything unravels. By early 1945, the writing was on the wall. Soviet forces were closing in from the east. American and British troops were tearing through from the west. Germany was collapsing. SS leadership panicked. They started burning files, shredding documents, moving children between facilities in the dead of night, often with no warning to staff or mothers. But there was simply too much. Too many buildings, too many records, too many people involved to erase it all in time. In April and May of 1945, American troops swept through Bavaria and Austria and found the estates. From the outside they looked ordinary, no fences, no guards, just quiet gardens and nurses tending to infants. Inside was a different story entirely. Soldiers found rooms full of babies, pregnant women, and toddlers, all under the supervision of SS-trained medical staff. And in the cabinets, files documenting exactly which SS officer fathered which child, racial measurements, family assignments, instructions for future upbringing, written out like a corporate manual for manufacturing human beings. This wasn't charity. This wasn't a hospital. This was a factory, and the paper trail proved it beyond doubt. When the war ended, thousands of Lebensborn children were left in a kind of identity limbo. Some were infants. Others were old enough to remember pieces of their past, but those memories had often been deliberately twisted by the people raising them. Reunification efforts were a nightmare. Records had been burned. Names had been changed. Some children had been told outright lies, that their real parents had abandoned them, that they were unwanted. Imagine being a small child, told over and over that the people who loved you gave up on you, when the truth was they'd been robbed of you by force. In Poland, families who had already survived occupation and deportation now had to face children who came home as strangers, physically different, emotionally distant, sometimes barely speaking their native tongue anymore. In Norway, it went a different direction entirely. Children born through Lebensborn were treated as living symbols of collaboration with the enemy, through absolutely no fault of their own. Mothers were publicly shamed. Children were bullied, isolated, and in some documented cases, placed into abusive institutional care simply because of how they were born. Here's the part that still makes historians uncomfortable. At the Nuremberg trials, Lebensborn was examined as part of the broader case against Nazi war crimes, specifically tied to forced Germanization and racial policy. Prosecutors laid out documented evidence of children stolen from occupied nations and funneled through this racial breeding pipeline. And yet, compared to the death camps, Lebensborn barely made a dent in public memory. The scale of mass murder overshadowed everything else, and understandably so. But that meant most of the doctors, nurses, and administrators who ran these homes walked away with little to no punishment. Some were questioned. Almost none served meaningful prison time. The children who survived this system were left carrying the weight of an atrocity that the world largely chose to forget. For decades, Lebensborn faded into obscurity, buried in scattered archives, discussed only in small academic circles. It wasn't until researchers gained access to surviving documents that the full picture started coming together, piece by piece, file by file, testimony by testimony. And in more recent years, DNA testing has done what governments and archives couldn't. Some survivors have finally found biological relatives after decades of not knowing their own origin story. Others never will. Some family lines simply vanished during the war, with no records left to trace. The scars from Lebensborn were never just physical. They were about identity, about being raised as a project instead of a person, and spending a lifetime trying to figure out who you actually were underneath the label the Nazis gave you. Lebensborn is proof that the horrors of the Nazi regime didn't only happen behind barbed wire and gas chambers. Sometimes they happened behind rose gardens and clean white curtains, hidden in plain sight, run with the quiet efficiency of a filing cabinet. If this story shook you the way it shook us researching it, make sure you're subscribed to WW2 Real History, because we uncover the hidden corners of history that mainstream documentaries leave out. Hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear this story, and let us know in the comments. Should we cover what happened to Lebensborn survivors after the war? Because that story is just as haunting. We'll see you in the next one.